All right. All right, so I was loading the PowerPoint up, and Jeremiah said, we're covering chapters 1, 2, and 3. And I said, and 4. And he said, in one day? Yes, we're going to give it a try. We're gonna ski across the top as best we can. Just getting an idea of the time here as we get started. And you have a handout. I think we got those, and that hopefully will help as we go along today. The hard thing is, I know there's places I want to stop and pause in Proverbs, and the hard thing will be to not pause too long, and as we go through. All right, so Proverbs chapters 1 through 4. So here, just by context of now this was working. Oh, okay, I turned it off. All right, so we're looking at 8 lessons on Proverbs. We looked at the introduction to the book of Proverbs. We looked at the Proverbs 1 through 7, which is sometimes called the preface or prologue to Proverbs last time. And there we mentioned the emphasis on the book of Proverbs, or gaining wisdom. The emphasis is on moral excellency. It's how we live our life. It's not, you're not going to read the book of Proverbs and be able to do calculus or atomic, whatever it was that Pastor was talking about this morning. Okay, that's not the mental enlightenment that we're going to get from reading the book of Proverbs. But we do gain, the more we read Proverbs, the more we think about Proverbs, the more we apply Proverbs to our lives, the better we get at understanding Proverbs. And so there's that. So we talked about that last time, and that was 2 weeks ago, because of the conversation we had last week on the Sabbath. So today we want to talk about Proverbs 1 through 4, and next week, Lord willing, Proverbs 5 through 9. And the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs kind of give us the clues that we need in order to understand the little proverbs that follow starting in chapter 10. So we could almost, I thought about trying to do 1 through 9 in one day, but I thought that might be rushing it a little too much. So I split it into 2. Then 3 topics that I picked randomly from the book of Proverbs to talk about. There's more, obviously, that we could talk about. But instead of looking at one particular proverb, there's many proverbs that talk about money. There's many proverbs that talk about wine and strong drink. There's many that talk about politics. I was listening to a lecture series on the book of Proverbs, and the teacher gave 3 hours to the believer's role in politics today. And what was interesting is he gave the lecture series when Barack Obama was president. So it was a little ways ago. It wasn't in our current milieu. So anyway, we'll see if we get out of that one without a church split. Well, that's pretty daring. What does the book of Proverbs say about the color of carpet? And then conclude with the theology of Proverbs, which is, what does the Proverbs teach us about God himself? What do we learn about him? So the Lord, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom. So here we are. As a reminder, wisdom teaching assumes there is an all-pervading plan and order for the universe, which man must follow and live according to in order to live with skill. In other words, God created the world to work a certain way. And if we live in accordance with that, life is going to be easier, basically. And if we try to live against it, life will be harder. So wisdom is skill in living. I almost thought about adding the word godly living in there. Wisdom is skill in godly living. That might be a good adjective to put in that. Okay, so outline of the book. So this is a broader outline of the book, the introduction 1 through 7, the discourse on wisdom, chapter 1, verse 8 through the end, 9, verse 28. And then we have collections. So we have the first collection of Solomon. We have 2 small collections, which are we're just told the words of the wise. Another large collection by Solomon. And then we have Agur, Lemuel, and the alphabet of the wifely excellence. Now, sometimes those 2 are put together because there's a break, but there isn't a break. And I didn't mention this in the introduction, but in some, so we have the Old Testament that we have had since about 300 to 400 years before Christ, without change. When Jesus refers to the Old Testament, when he talks about the law of Moses, when he talks about the writings, when he talks about the prophets, that set of books, the same set we have in our scriptures, is identical to what we have in our scriptures. It came to us complete and whole. Now, there are some places where the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible differs a little bit, and sometimes that makes us wonder if things weren't in other orders previously, but we don't have a Hebrew text with things out of order. Anyway, so I say all that to say, in one of the Greek translations of the Old Testament, chapter 31 is split up into 2 different chapters. So that's why sometimes you'll see it split out as 2. But, I mean, we could also attribute it to Lemuel's mother. I don't have a problem with that either. But there are some that have it separated. Hence it's separated here. Okay, so the value of wisdom. So here we're going to get into chapter 1. And we're going to talk about chapter 1. So chapter 1 describes the value of wisdom. And I've got it here as the whole chapter. There are some that will say there's a little interlude in verse 20. But there are 3 points, I'll just put them on here, that Solomon makes in this first section. Oh no, whoops, sorry. I forgot what slide I was on. Okay, overview of chapters 1 through 4. In chapter 1, verse 8, you see the phrase, "Hear my son." So what people will do as they come to Proverbs is they look for that phrase, "my son," and they say that every time you see "my son," it starts a new section. Okay, so chapter 1, here we go, verse 8 starts with "my son," and it goes through verse 33. Chapter 2, verse 1 starts with "my son" again, and it's the benefits of seeking wisdom. So in chapter 1, the general idea, this is someone's outline, is avoid the criminal element. Okay, so the value of wisdom is that to value wisdom, we avoid the criminal element. In chapter 2, it tells us the benefits of seeking wisdom. Chapter 3, again, verse 1 starts with "my son," talks about what true wisdom and success looks like. And then chapter 4 actually has 3 short sections that start with "my son." So it talks about inherited wisdom, actually talks about the wisdom of his grandfather, talks about the choice of wisdom, and then it talks about consecrating yourself to wisdom. So this outline comes from, just chapters 1 through 4, because that's all we're covering today, comes from that phrase, "Hear my son," in each of those verses, 1:8, 2:1, 3:1, 4:1, 4:10, and 4:20. I'll start with "my son." Now, the outline that I'm giving you in your handout in class is slightly different, but it's a little bit more practical, maybe, applicable. Okay, so let's start here. So, this just says preparation. chapters 1 through 9, chapter 1, verse 8 through the end of chapter 9, the purpose, we're told, from verses 1 through 7, is to prepare us for understanding what we normally consider, a proverb, a short saying. In Hebrew, it'll be 2 lines usually, memorable, general truth that teaches a spiritual activity. And so how does it prepare us for doing that? And that's the question that I'm raising now, but we'll look at through chapters 1 through 4. And I think the way it prepares us is it gives us certain things, certain character qualities, if I can put it that way. Or the word I want to use is disposition. Now, disposition I think it's the right word, but to try to describe it, it's like an attitude that you have towards something. So I may have used this illustration before, I don't know, but someone used this illustration with me and I found it helpful. They said, what direction are their toes pointing? That's the disposition. If you're not sure about someone or where they're at, and you say, well, what direction are their toes pointing? Well, if they're pointing in the right direction, even though they might be, you're not exactly sure where they're at, what direction are their toes pointing? Because that's the direction they're kind of moving in. So Proverbs chapters 1 through 9 kind of describe for us a disposition of what we should be like if we want to be wise. If we want to understand and apply Proverbs to our lives, what is it that we need? So they're not really tools, so to speak, as tools like in a toolbox. What do you need to build a table? But they're more like, what kind of person do you need to be before you come to the Proverbs? What is it that you should be, your attitudes should be? So this is how the book of Proverbs prepares us. So what I've done in this lesson, and I plan to do in the next one, is to talk about what are those principles and how do they prepare us for understanding the Proverbs. So that's kind of the direction I'm taking with this. Did that make any sense? There. Okay. Maybe. My wife will tell me later. Okay. So here's chapter 1. And you'll notice that here I put listening to others, chapter 1, verses 8 through 33. Now, chapter 1, if you hopefully have your Bibles open there to Proverbs 1, verses 8 and 9 say this: "Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching." There is so much we could talk about this one verse, but I'm going to keep moving. "For they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck." Okay, so this is kind of an introduction, and each section starts with a similar introduction, where the father is trying to get the son to desire to see the beauty of wisdom and to desire wisdom. And as we know, young boys need a lot of help that way. But he says, hear my son, your father's instruction, forsake not your mother's teaching. Mother is also involved. The word teaching there is actually Torah, which is the word for law in the Old Testament. For they are a graceful garland for you. So the father starts out, and the son has a choice to make. Who is he going to listen to? Who is he going to go to for advice? Well, hopefully, you have wise parents. Now again, this is a general principle. Not everyone has wise parents that you want to go to and ask spiritual advice of. That was my case growing up. I did not go to my father for spiritual advice. I learned from his example and did not what he did. So hopefully you have wise parents that you can turn to for advice. But now, who else could you turn to for advice? Verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice you, Do not consent. The old King James, consent thou not. This was a verse we had our girls memorize. And it's very interesting because when, little kids recite verses, Sophia was very dogmatic. Consent thou not, and I think it worked for her. But, he goes in and he says, if sinners, now what are the sinners going to entice you to do? To sin, right? To break dance? What? Oh, break windows. Yeah, they're not enticing you to go to Perkins and have a muffin, right? That's not what they're enticing you to do. It doesn't say. Sinners are enticing you. It means they're trying to entice you to sin. Hey, go with us because we're going to go get in trouble. And that trouble is described here in chapter 1, the kinds of things that they're going to do. So the answer to the question is simply no, right? Hey, Eric, do you want to come and do this with us? What are you going to do? Well, we're going to do this, sinful stuff. No. Well, don't you like us? That's not the question. You're going to go do that stuff? No, I'm not going to do that. And I think a lot of Christians today could be helped by this verse, because a lot of times Christians seem to think too much about it. Well, should I go and do that activity? Well, maybe I should. Well, how am I supposed to be a good testimony if I don't go? Well, maybe I could, if they're bringing beer, I'll bring root beer. Well, and you hear all these things, and it's like, no, that keeps it simple. You just tell them no. Okay. If sinners entice you, consent thou not. Now, another thing to point, this is kind of an aside. We mentioned that Proverbs are general principles, and that sometimes what we're looking for is how to apply them to life situations. But there are some statements in Proverbs, like this one, that you don't have to figure out when to apply it. There's no sin that you can say, well, if the sinner entices me to participate in that sin, it's okay, but the proverb doesn't apply there, but the proverb applies to that sin over there. No, this is an absolute statement. If someone's enticing you to sin, the answer is no. Now, in the old days, I had to have someone come up to me and say, hey, Eric, we're going to go do X. Do you want to come with us? Or more likely, come with us. We're going to go get in trouble. Nowadays, though, how are sinners enticing us? Are they coming up and whispering in our ears to go do something? To go break windows? No. Well, they can do that. They can think of things if you're already with them. I was thinking more along these lines. Social media is all big one enticement to sin, right? I mean, even if it's vanity, look at my perfect life. And don't you wish you could have a perfect life like me? These social influencers who pretend to be something that they're not just so that they can make money off of people who think they're wonderful. Commercials, I hate commercials. Radio, television, it doesn't matter. I can't stand commercials. Commercials are all enticements. Now, some of them might be enticements to sin. Some of them are just enticements to foolishness. You don't need a new car. Well, maybe you do. You might need a new car. But you don't deserve a new car, we'll put it that way. So they're full of lies and half-truths. So we have to be very careful about, because this has changed a lot over time. But this is a proverb that shows us that some of the things in Proverbs are absolute and not general truths. Okay, so I could park a long time on that. The son has a choice. He can listen to his wise parents. He can listen to his foolish peers. Now, it doesn't say that they're peers here in chapter 1, but most people take it as peers. And there's a lot we could talk about that too. But we take our children who are immature, we put them with a bunch of other immature children, and then we expect them to not be immature anymore. That has to make us think. Okay. They're foolish peers. And then Lady Wisdom. So it starts in verse 20. Yeah, I got that right. And you'll notice in verse 20 of chapter 1, wisdom cries aloud in the street. In the markets, she raises her voice. At the head of the noisy street, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gate, she speaks, and then it gives her speech. So wisdom, Lady Wisdom, is pictured throughout the book of Proverbs, and she's introduced here, and she's very vocal. She's very public. Anybody who wants to find her knows where to find her. In fact, you can find her almost anywhere. And she cries out to the simple, saying, I can offer you wisdom. Come, listen to me, and I will give you advice. And so the young man can go to Lady Wisdom, and obviously this is a metaphor, and find wisdom. So the first kind of characteristic, or as we prepare ourselves to study Proverbs, one of the things that we can ask ourselves is, if I want to be a wise person, I think from chapter 1, a question we can ask ourselves is, who do we ask for advice? That's very telling. So a number of years ago, I'll give you a story about this. A number of years ago, a young man was interested in a young woman. And he wanted to marry her. Who did he seek advice from? Well, in this story, it's a true story. He went to his younger brother and asked his advice. What do you think? Do you like this girl? Should I marry her? And what do you think the younger brother said? Sure. So why didn't the young man go to his father or his older brother and ask for advice? Or his pastor? Or somebody else? Because what were all those people going to say? No, we don't think she's right for you. He knew that. He didn't want to hear it. So he went someplace else to get the answer he wanted. He wasn't genuinely seeking advice. As we think about growing up, maturing, one of the questions we should ask ourselves is, who do we ask for advice? Proverbs says in a multitude of counselors, there's wisdom. And I had a young man one time who was trying to apply this principle to his life, legitimately. And so he was about 18 at the time, and he had a number of older men that he had started to collect, so to speak, to ask questions of, to seek advice from. And I said to him one time, I said, well, have you also talked to your pastor about this? No. Why not? Well, his dad had a fight with the pastor and taught the son to disrespect the pastor. And the son would not go to the pastor for advice. That should be a red flag. That should be an issue to us. Who are we going to for advice? So in chapter 1, the son is given a choice. Who to listen to. Son, if you're going to be wise, who are you going to listen to? Wise parents? We could extrapolate that to wise older people. Your foolish peers, or Lady Wisdom? Where are you going to go to seek advice? All right, so in chapter 2, I say following here, and in the notes I say example. But the young man again is given some choices. He says in chapter 2, verse 1, my son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your heart to understanding. So, inclining towards something. You're inclining your heart towards understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. for the Lord gives wisdom. So, verse 5 there. So again, the young man has choices to make as to whose example he's going to follow. Whose example do you follow? And again, hopefully as a wise father, whose example he can follow. That's in the text, this young man does. Or again, if you don't have a wise father to ask those questions of, you find someone to ask those questions of who takes that place. So in the first few verses, we find again, we have a wise father whose example he can follow. In verse 6, he says, "For the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He's a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding the paths of justice and watching over the ways of his saints." So the Lord does things. The Lord acts. And he acts wisely. So he is an example for us to follow. Now, we say our Savior is more than just an example. There are some people that say that Jesus is only a good example and no more than that. But even though Jesus is God, and even though Jesus is our Savior, he is also a good example. Okay. So just because he's God and he's our Savior doesn't mean he's not a good example to follow. But the Lord is a good example to follow. Pastor and I were just talking about after the service, I asked him a question about Numbers 20, where Pastor was talking about, if you remember, a few minutes ago, he was talking about there's a promise. God mentions, "I promised Esau this land, Mount Seir." But we don't have record of the Lord coming to Esau and saying, "I'm giving you Mount Seir." There's no words like that, like he did to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what's the promise? Well, we know that God had done that in the past. He had spoken to individuals. He had made promises of land. He had done those things. There's examples to follow in how God acts mercifully, how God keeps his promise during that to Esau and to the people of Edom. Okay, so God is a God who keeps his promises. So what kind of people should we be? Right? We can follow the Lord's example. God is merciful and slow to anger and quick to forgive. What kind of people should we be? So we can follow the Lord's example. All that to say that. The crooked. So you'll notice a pattern here. Let's see, where do I want to go down to? So he says, it's actually wrapped up in verse 12. This is some of the things that the Lord does. He delivers us from the way of evil, from men of perverted speech. Now notice there's a bunch of metaphors here about these people, and I use the word crooked to kind of describe them. The word perverted is crooked. Who forsake the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perverseness of evil. That word perverse again is the word crooked. Men whose paths are crooked, there it's stated, and who are devious in their ways. And then he goes on to the forbidden woman, and she's crooked, and she tells half lies and half lies, things like that. So you could follow after, the young man could follow after the paths of the crooked person. That's an option he has. Am I going to follow their example? Or is he going to follow the example of the righteous? So in verse 20, it says, "So you will walk in the way of the good and keep the paths of the righteous." So in this chapter, he's given 4 options of people whose example he could follow. And as we want to be wise and we want to study Proverbs and we prepare ourselves to do so, then we can ask ourselves the question of whose example do we follow? Is it the example of the world? Is it the example of the sinful people? Is it the example of the simple people who just float around and don't live with conviction? And you'll notice that in both of these, I mean, there's some work on our part. If I can't go to my parents for advice, I need to find someone whose judgment I trust, and I need to go ask them for advice. I need to build that relationship if I want to be a wise person. There are traps out there, the foolish peers. I need to look for examples, godly examples that I want to follow, and say, this person has shown that they are trustworthy in this area. They are wise in this area. I want to follow their example. I might not understand everything right now, but again, I'm going to do what they tell me to, or I'm going to do what they do because I see the results of that. So following after, or the example. All right, chapter 3, ways and ends. The book of Proverbs, chapter 3 is very much this way. We'll say, if you're wise, then good things are going to happen to you. And in the way chapter 3 sets it up, it's, if you want good things to happen to you, then be wise. Okay, so it looks at the end of the way and determines whether or not those decisions are the wise ones. Is that the route you want to go? And I was trying to remember who it was, but you know, when you grow up, people stick things in your head and you don't always know who stuck what where. But there was somebody used to say, when you choose the beginning of a path, you simultaneously choose the end of it. What Proverbs chapter 3 is saying, look to the end of the path before you make your choice. You can see where it's going to go. And so see which one you want. So in chapter 3, verse 1, he says, my son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace, they will add to you. And he goes on again here for a couple more verses about how great they are. But you see we know verses 5 quite well. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. But verse 7 goes right along with it. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. So this is the kind of the second point, the Lord's way. If you look at the end of the path and say, that doesn't look very comfortable. I don't know that I want to go that way. I want